had this pain that began to appear in my midsection. Went to my doctor. He said, "You obviously have a gallbladder situation. You need to have it taken care of immediately." So I went to the recommended surgeon, and he insisted that I come in the next week and have this done. And I thought, that's very fast. And I asked him all the right questions. How long have you been doing this? How many patients have you seen? And all the answers to my questions were evasively answered because they were all bad answers on his part. And I called our family doctor and said, call this hospital, tell them that I am not going to go through the surgery. The doctor said, hey, you're just afraid. Come on, go through with it. Anyway, went in for the surgery that morning, and it was a laparoscopic procedure using an instrument that makes a half-inch wide cut. What went wrong was the instrument was held at the wrong angle. Instead of going in half an inch, it went in 5.5 inches by my belly button. Then it went through my aorta. My blood pressure went down to 30/10. The nurses that were there said instantly, "You've killed Steve." And it stayed at 30/10 for an hour and 15 minutes. Well, my blood completely bled out. My heart stopped. All my organs ceased from working. And I was flatlined for 7.5 minutes. And I felt like I was floating. I opened my eyes, I looked down and realized, oh my word, I'm dead. I heard a voice to my left side asking me questions. The first thing I heard was, "Steve, it's going to be okay." In that moment, I heard this voice, which I know now was God's voice, saying, "How many hours a week do you work?" And I said, embarrassingly, 100 hours. And what I heard back was, "From now on, I want you to be a turtle, not a rabbit." And that I should live differently, living a life of focus, a life of balance. And I have recovered significantly since then. I do have numbers of problems still that'll maybe never get better, and I can live with that. Before, I had written 2 books that sold okay. Since then, I've written 12 more books, and they have sold enormously well. I think the difference is that I have really figured out what I'm for in life. When people figure out what they're for in life, they are dangerous in a good way. They put a dent in the world. And I think I'm putting my little teeny dent in the world by knowing what I'm for and devoting myself to that.
Tell us what happened.
Well, I have...
this is amazing.
I've been traveling quite a bit, telling the story about the kindness, generosity message for a few years. And in the middle of all that traveling, I one night felt this incredible pain in my midsection. And I'm not the kind of guy that roughs it. I went to my doctor a few days later. I said, "Gee, I had this pain." And it was unusual. It wasn't just indigestion. And he said, "You're about the right age. I think you might have a gallbladder problem."
Wow.
And he immediately wrote up a script, said, "Go see this doctor. He's a surgeon, fantastic guy." And went down there, and within a minute or so, he said, "You definitely have a gallbladder problem. But we'll do some tests just to double check, but I just assure you right now you have a gallbladder problem. You need to take that sucker out." He called it a sucker. And so went through the testing procedures. They could not find my gallbladder. And he said, that is all the more evidence that you have a shriveled up, very diseased gallbladder, and you could have at any time a major gallbladder problem. And well, what it turns out, and this is the irony of ironies, is I was born without a gallbladder. Yeah, they went in to do a keyhole or laparoscopic surgery. Went in and did a blind entry, they call it, with something that looks kind of like a plastic staple gun. And it goes in about a half an inch deep if it's done correctly. The first 3 entries were along my side here. You can still see the scars. And the 4th and final entry was by my belly button. And for some reason, it was held at a wrong angle. And instead of going in a half an inch, it went in 5.5 inches.
Wow.
Now, all of us who have had 8th grade biology know that there's some pretty important physiology beneath your belly button. So this half-inch wide razor blade thing, like an arrow almost, went through the middle of my aorta and did not cut it in half, did not sever it, but went through the middle of it. There's still some tissue on the sides of it, and then landed into my spine, cutting several nerve bundles. And then the whole mechanism pops up above my belly button, and for some reason the surgeon just pulled the whole mechanism out, making everything larger. Well, there were 2 nurses there, and both of them went to my church. And the first thing they said was, "You've killed Steve." Because there have been about well, as of a couple of years ago, 250,000 of these accidents with a double aortic puncture, only 4 people have survived. A woman in Japan, a guy in Florida, a guy in Michigan, and me. I bled for an hour and 15 minutes and went flatline like an ER. The beep, that went on for 7.5, almost 8 minutes.
When did you come to the point where you knew you died?
Well, the next thing I knew was I felt on my back something poking against my back, and it turned out to be a bolt on the ceiling. And it felt very much like a helium balloon with lots of helium, a freshly filled helium balloon tapping on the ceiling. And that was my body, or my spirit body, whatever. And I was looking down upon this scene of this dead body, and yet I didn't feel any fear, no trepidation, no sense of negative anticipation whatsoever. And then I heard this voice, which I now totally, absolutely believe was God's voice. It sounded not like James Earl Jones, a.k.a. Darth Vader. It sounded like 100 voices. But the first thing I heard was, "Don't worry, Steve, it's going to be okay," which was the exact opposite of everything objectively that I saw going on down there. This looked like, up the creek without a paddle down there. And when they managed to get enough blood back into me,
they poured a lot of blood into you because
55 units. I was dead at the time, clinically dead, but I heard them say 55 units of blood. When they got that pumped into me to the point where my heart began to function again, I was immediately back into my body and felt no pain again, but I was completely conscious that the anesthesia had no effect on me. And for the next several weeks I was in a coma, but I heard everything. They told my wife and friends, he will die probably today.
Now, it's very interesting because right after that happened to you, you were visited by deceased people who prayed around your bed.
Well, the 4 around me were in a prayer circle, and as I looked at them, I knew that they had died in the ICU. I knew that they were all believers. I knew what they had died of. I knew what they had done as in life. One was a college student, age 19. I knew what he majored in. I even knew what his dad did for a living. And that was all absolutely, you couldn't ask the nurses because they won't tell you, but I asked my doctor to check into it, and he did. And he said, you're exactly right, and all 100% right. At 2:30 in the morning, 3 nights in a row, but I had this breathing mechanism, what do you call it, a respirator in my throat. And that is very uncomfortable, by the way, my word. And she kept coming in and saying, look, you need to take this thing seriously and cooperate with the healing process, or it doesn't look good for you. And she said, you've been promised life, and yet you need to do your part as well. And my recovery began that night at 2:30 in the morning, and it began to climb so rapidly that on the 6th day, they removed my breathing apparatus. They said, we don't know what happened, but it's been an amazing recovery. And on the 7th day, they moved me out of ICU. One album called Shot of Love. Mm-hmm. And it was like I was getting this shot of love from God himself. Don't worry, Steve, it's going to be okay. And I tell you, this sounds like an exaggeration, but I wake up every morning, going on 10 years now since this happened, and my first thought every morning is that exact thought spontaneously, it's going to be okay. Because I know that I'm living on borrowed time.
When did anything happen after that? Once, don't worry, Steve, it's going to be okay. Was there anything else to the conversation?
Oh, there was a lot of conversation. In my book, The Day I Died, I really, the first third is about the experience. The last 2/3 are really about this ongoing conversation that I had with God. The next thing he asked me is, by the way, how long do you work each week? The funny thing is, and the timing of God, how things kind of gear shift together, not surprisingly to you, I'm sure. The day before, I was meeting with my best friend, who's an African-American pastor in Cincinnati, and I got there a little bit early, kept very careful track of hours worked per week, time I get up, and so on and so forth. I'm just kind of meticulous about that kind of thing. And that day I had this thought, this kind of, I call it a flutterby. It's just a, it's still a small voice of God kind of going by kind of thing. And not a screaming, yelling, skyrocket kind of thing, but a flutterby. And the flutterby I got was, how many hours a week do you work anyway? Because it was the end of the year. I was just kind of reflecting on the year, getting toward Christmas. And I thought, gee whiz, how many, I work an awful lot this year. I work a lot all the time. And I calculated that in 97 I'd worked about 120 hours a week. And so God says, ironically, how many hours a week do you work? And I, obviously it's a self-answering question because I just done that the day before. 120 hours a week, God. And he goes, well, from now on I want you to become a turtle, not a rabbit, on living a focused life, not a scattered life. Not a life that is just running in circles, that doesn't have any strategy to it, but going from this, down to 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 this. Being into the nano laser focus, if you will. Discovering the one or two or three things that only maybe I can do. And I believe, this may sound a little bit out there, but I think that everybody who follows Jesus has a focus that only they can do. That there's only one mark in all the world, because you're filled with God's Spirit. And the older you get, the more this becomes apparent. One of the messages of Proverbs, I think there's only really a couple, three messages that seem to be over and over again repeated. One of them is that if you are wise, you're a person of accurate self-awareness. And one of those things is that as you discover what I am really about as a unique creation of Christ in you, the hope of glory, right? Mm-hmm. That unique filter that Jesus has made me to be, that I say no strategically to a lot of things that may seem like good things, but I say yes to the Jesus things that He's called me to do. But to do that, you have to be kind of listening, kind of slowed down enough that you can hear. That doesn't mean we don't get a lot done. I actually get a lot more done now. Mm-hmm. I've written 14 books. I only wrote 2 books before my accident. And even though I work a lot less, I only work, honestly, in terms of work output, I work at the very most about 30 hours a week. And yet, every day I write 3 articles for my 15 websites. I am writing often 2 books a year. Not to brag or anything, but I just get so much more done, even though I am living at, my metronome is not going 220 beats per minute anymore. Right. Because at 220 beats per minute, you really don't hear Jesus. The flutterbys are very difficult to pick up on. You have to, it's just very difficult to pick up on the flutterbys at that pace. When you slow it down to a normal pace so that you're actually able to hear God. Otherwise, the only time you hear God is when you're taking a shower or driving.
Mm-hmm. What would you say to the average person watching right now, how to slow down to God's speed of life?
I think that we, very, very simply, we begin to pray this dangerous prayer, is God, I want to hear from you. Mm-hmm. I want to hear from you. And then we actually take that next step of anticipating hearing from God. Because I think a lot of people say, I want to hear from you, but they don't really mean it. And then when you pray that dangerous prayer, you actually take the time and the anticipation that He is going to begin to speak. Because telephones actually have 2 parts, a speaking part and a listening part. And the whole notion of prayer implies that we are going to speak and we're going to listen. And listening is not that complicated. It is very, very simple. We, through tradition or through whatever, through human imaginations, make it so complicated. It is so childlike and so simple. It is really, Blackaby said, it is a inspired idea.
Exactly.
Inspired idea. So, as we get inspired ideas from God, and it's a subjective thing, it's possibly not exactly accurate, but as we keep doing it, we get a little more of a track record. Yes.
We begin to discern more clearly.
But we will never be very effective at living this Jesus-focused life and really doing that one focused thing that we are really all about, that only Steve and Mark can do, of all the people in the world in the borrowed time we're living on, until we are able to hear the thing that Jesus is calling us to be about.